This evening, the Carter-Jenkins Center will present a lecture on the concept of the development of the self and the object content in human beings. This, in my view, is an extraordinarily important concept for psychoanalysts and to understand human development. Unfortunately, has been extraordinarily neglected to this day, and on occasion extraordinarily distorted. The lecture tonight will be based on a paper that I wrote, chapter 5 of my book, entitled The Developmental Approach to Childhood Psychopathology. And that chapter, chapter 5, is called Self and Object. Before we get into this, I should refer to the work of Piaget, which is of course fundamental in this regard and extraordinarily valuable to this day. And particularly, I want to refer to what he calls the period of sensory motor intelligence, which is a stage in the life of children from birth to the second year, and there are essentially about 8 stages that he describes in great detail in a book that you will see in a moment. I highly recommend, that describes Piaget's work in enormous detail and very clearly. Before I enter into my own paper, I want to read to you from this book that I highly recommended, parts of the, as I said, period of sensory motor intelligence, but it's a stage 1, which goes from birth to 1 month of age, and is considered all a reflex. In this first stage, or stage 1, which begins at birth, and through this whole month, the behavior of the infant is entirely reflexive. The basic reflexes that the infant is born with, and this is a quote from this book, are sucking, grasping, crying, movement of arms, trunk and head, and sometimes legs. Now, that's not controlled by the child. It's random movements. He cannot do this at will. When the infant is stimulated, his reflexes will respond, of course. Thus, when an object is put in the infant's mouth, he will suck on it, whatever it is, because it's a reflex response to having something on his mouth. When any object gets in contact with the palm of his hand, he will grasp it, regardless of what it is. It's a reflex action. There is no evidence that the infant behaving in this way can differentiate between the different objects that are placed in his hands and so on. His reflex responses are more or less the same to all objects. A blanket is sucking us on as vigorously as a milk producing nipple. Just as a reflex action, something in his mouth and he sucks. The hand will grasp whatever comes in contact with it, be that somebody else's hand, finger, toy, or whatever. It makes no distinction between these different stimuli. Thus, during this stage, the infant assimilates all the stimuli through the reflex system. Within a few weeks, though, of birth, there is somewhat what Piaget calls accommodations on the part of the child that you can observe. As we said, at birth, the infant will suck whatever is placed in his mouth, and it will suck only when presented. But soon afterwards, the infant begins to search for the nipple. If it cannot be found, in effect, accommodated to the environment. In other words, some kind of obscure distinction between the nipple that produces milk and other objects starts to take place. That searching of the nipple by the infant is something that was not present at birth. And the searching itself cannot be attributed to any reflex system because there is no researching reflex that is acknowledged. So that's stage one, and I wanted to highlight it for you in the views of Piaget, with whom I totally agree, and because I think it clarifies, perhaps, some of the confusion that exists in terms of what are the innate givens that the child is born with, and what is in the cognitive sense of the word that he is really capable of. Now, various authors that have been describing these early stages in self and object representation formation, that is not an innate phenomenon. The idea of the existence of objects or even of the existence of the self as it is constructed later. As the brain matures, a stimuli reaches the child and things are starting to coalesce in different ways. So, many authors, as I said, describe these stages in self and object representation in terms of a self-object matrix, out of which self and object will finally become differentiated. For example, Jacobson and Kember in 75 and 76, 1975 and 1976. Naturally enough, later pathology, narcissistic, borderline, and psychotic is frequently explained on the basis of such a model. Invariably, these theories place the accent on failures in the mother-child relationship or on failures more or less dramatic, depending on the author, of the world of objects, as Kohut in 1977, for example, has recently, some 30 years ago, postulated, no very recently. In my judgment, This is at times an incorrect formulation because it ignores many intermediary steps, such as the cognitive development of the infants and how it takes place, the maturation of the brain, the reception of a stimuli, and the organization of such a stimuli into meaningful pathways in the brain and so on. It is thus a sort of descriptive shorthand, this formulation that I am referring to. But it is pregnant with dangers of interpretative error, and so it has for many years. I believe this can be so even on those occasions where in fact the psychopathology can be explained on the basis of unsatisfactory modeling or poor early object relationship, as is indeed frequently the case. On the other hand, such causative interpretation in terms of failure in object relations are applied as a theological explanation for all cases that descriptively fit one of the above-mentioned clinical pictures, when in fact many of them are the result of a variety of ego failure or even genetic predispositions. Thus, we can correctly understand the mechanisms involved in such pathology only if we consider a multiplicity of other factors. The self-object matrix that I just mentioned substantially ignores well-established facts about the cognitive and ego development of children, which is surprising, but is the case. This perhaps is being corrected nowadays a little bit by the developments of neuroscientists, knowledge and explanations. Yet, the way the ego cognitive organization acquires a structure, content, and significant meaning does have considerable psychological impact on the later emotional structure of the personality and its conflicts, on its assets and deficits. It is frequently ignored that the child must learn everything. He is like a blank screen at birth, and pathways in response to repeated forms of stimuli that he can develop in his brain and finally establish as significant methods of dealing with stimuli. Take a long time, a lot of brain maturation, which takes years sometimes in some aspects, and a lot of appropriate stimulation at the appropriate stage in development. So, how does it happen then that the infant separates self from objects, and how is that process significant to later psychological life? That is, how is that process of differentiation of self and object significant to later psychological life? We are thus faced with the problem of trying to map out and understand in as much detail as is possible how the self-representations are acquired and built up from birth onward, and perhaps even earlier, perhaps in utero. So that's more questionable. Out of that very gradual building up, a final concept of the self will evolve as a psychologically viable and operative entity, functional entity. The same line of argument applies to the development in the infant's mind of the concept of objects. They are not, the concept of object is not an innate given in infants, far from it. But for such mappings of the development of the concept of the self and of the object, we must keep as close as we can to what we know about the level of cognition, possibly, that is possible in the newly born. In other words, what is his true cognitive capacity at this point, and how much of what is theoretically postulated by authors dealing with the development of the self-representation and the self in present-day theory is actually possible. The same question might also be asked regarding the concept of objects and object representations. Otherwise, we may fall into the error of assuming that the newly born infant's level of mentation, his capacity to process stimuli, and his actual functional abilities are actually far beyond what is in fact the actual case. This reification of his functional abilities can lead only to incorrect formulation, to a sort of mythology that has no bearing on what is really happening in the infant's brain and in the development of his mind. Now, talking a little bit about the development of the infant cognitive capacity, we must look now closely at how the infant's cognitive capacity very slowly and gradually actually unfolds during the first month of life. It follows that our models of how self and object representations are built and the concept of the self and object finally acquired must be closely correlated with this unfolding of the child's cognitive capacities. With this in mind, I will present some more of, in a highly condensed manner, a summary of some of Piaget's view about the cognitive capacity for infants and how they develop during the first 2 years of life. According to Piaget, in 1967, the reflex behaviors that I already described are the typical type of mental functioning during the first month of life. That is, stage 1, which is from birth to the end of the first month. And they begin to be modified immediately. And during the next 3 months, which is stage 2, rapid and very important change will be taking place. Significantly, according to Piaget, the earlier reflex activity that I described briefly before now becomes integrated into somewhat more organized perceptions and habits, leading to new observable behaviors partly acquired through learning by experience and by the maturation that is taking place in his brain. By 9 to 12 months, for example, thumb sucking becomes a habit and reflects the increased hand-mouth coordination. Clearly, habituation to thumb sucking cannot be explained by the reflexes described above, but it can be understood by the child's discovery of sensory-motor relationships while acting on an environment, the existence of which is unknown to him at the beginning. Of course, the fact that the newly found activity gives pleasure is of enormous importance in forming that habit of sucking the thumb. He can also by then follow moving objects with his eyes, eye coordination, and his head in the direction of sounds, which means eye-ear coordination. That couldn't happen before. He was not able to do that. His brain had not matured enough to allow him to make these different moves. Now, as you know, the maturation of the central nervous system goes from the top of the head to the feet, and it goes so very gradually during the for many functions during the first 2 years of life. So that the infant, for example, at birth can hold his head. That's why you have to hold his head. Otherwise he'll be flopping around, you know. So by the third month, the myelinization of the pyramidal waist has reached that level and the level of the shoulders, and by then he can hold his head erect and can move it from side to side, which allows him to look for moving objects. The field of vision is now 180 degrees, while in fact that was not the case. By the same token, and around the same time, he acquires control, willful control over his arm and his hand, so that he can purposefully get his thumb into his mouth and suck. And as you know, that can become a significant habit that may last several years, sometimes even into adulthood. Piaget points out as well that from the 5th week onwards, an observer has a distinct impression that the child seems to recognize some persons in some ill-defined way, and yet there is no evidence that the child has any notion whatsoever of a person out there or an object out there. Piaget's belief that what the infant recognizes is a sort of animated perceptual presence, but that this does not imply an awareness of the substance and permanence of that perceptual presence in the outside world. In fact, he had no idea of the outside world at this point. And as you know, studies by René Spitz later on demonstrated very clearly that if you present the child with a mask that has 3 dark spots representing the 2 eyes and the mouth, you will, after the 3rd month of life, the child will produce a smile, which is a reflex phenomenon. But very frequently, of course, when that starts to happen, the parents feel that they are being recognized by the infant, but it's recognized as a gestalt of the 3 spots that represent the human face, to which he can produce a reflex kind of response in the form of smile. It also does not imply that he starts to recognize in a sort of obscure way an animated perceptual presence. But it doesn't imply an awareness of the substance and permanence of that perceptual presence in the outside world, as we just mentioned. It doesn't imply either even a beginning dissociation between the self and the external world. That means separation of self and external world. Yet, as I see it, the fact remains that he can now make certain distinctions that he couldn't make before. He can recognize in inverted commas, the nipple from which milk flows are different from other suckable things. In some sense, we can speak here of some process of adaptation to external reality, and yet call this process accommodation. As long as we are aware, remain aware, that the child has no knowledge of external reality except through the presentations made by external reality through perception. In other words, it is not differences in external things themselves that the child at this age recognizes, but it's differences in the marks that perception leaves in the infant's perceptual reality. He has a perceptual apparatus, and it receives impressions, and these impressions are different according to the objects in the external reality that he doesn't recognize and presents him with, but he has a perception of these things, and this leaves memory traces and builds itself up gradually. This type of behavioral changes are among the first observable signs that an internal organization is taking place. They imply some adaptation to the world outside the child, the existence of which is unknown to the infant at that point. In any case, what is important is that the child is now making primitive sensory motor differentiations and acquiring limited sensory motor coordination. As I said, thanks to his being exposed to a variety of large forms of stimulation and to the brain maturation and the myelinization of his pyramidal ways. Now, another maturational development that helps the infant processes of differentiation of self and object is that he can now, as we say earlier, move his head towards the source of the sound and look at the objects in inverted commas, because he doesn't know what they are, that he hears. In other words, he has eye-ear coordination. He hears, his head goes in that particular direction. This indicates a new coordination between vision and hearing, as we have been saying. Around this time, the infant starts to follow the path of an object. Object in inverted commas. Remember, he had no concept of objects. It's a thing that moves in front of his perceptual apparatus, his eyes, until it disappears from his view. As the background to all that I have described up to this point, I should add that Piaget has demonstrated that up till now, that is stage 2, 1 to 4 months, the infant's behavior essentially lacks intentionality in the sense of willfully initiating behaviors directed at certain goals. With some exception, he may move his hand to put his thumb in his mouth when the myelinization of the pyramidal waves have taken place. Behaviors are in fact still, for the most part, primarily reflexive, though somewhat modified, and that modification continues to take place gradually. And goals are set off only after behavior sequences have begun. During the next stage, which is Piaget's stage 3, which covers from 8 to 8 months, one can observe the appearance of intentional behavior in the infant. His behavior can now follow a sequence clearly aimed at the goals he means to obtain. That was not possible in the previous phase. Indeed, he specifically selects the means that will obtain his goal, obviously within certain limits. During this stage, stage 3, the infant behavior becomes more and more oriented towards objects, that is, objects in inverted commas and meaning things and persons that are out there, but he doesn't know exactly what they are, and towards events beyond his body. Thus, he now grasps and manipulates anything he can reach. Another observable new characteristic is the infant's tendency to actively repeat any new interesting or unusual experience that he has. Effectively, before this stage, he had been unable to distinguish himself from other objects, again, objects in inverted commas, on a sensory motor level. Similarly, he was unable to coordinate his hands with his eyes and mouth, at least in part because of lack of maturation, as we said, of his central nervous system, and which really means myelinization of the pyramidal waves reaching the level of the neck and the shoulders. For an exploration of the problems that are involved in all of this behavior from the psychoanalytic point of view, you can read a very interesting article by the analyst Willy Hoffer, written in 1949. Piaget believes that at this time the child begins to anticipate the positions that objects will follow while moving through his field of vision. And that indicates that the child is developing a beginning awareness of the permanence of the object, an awareness that he did not have before, as you will see. Yet, in spite of this, the infant still continues to see himself as the cause of all activity. Indeed, he sees himself as the cause of all events. And this is, of course, an egocentric position that is based in the lack of cognitive development to understand things the way they really are. Now, toward the end of the next phase, stage 4, which is 8 to 12 months, certain behavioral patterns emerge that demonstrate the first clear acts of intelligence, actual intelligence. The infant begins to use means to obtain ends, which shows that he's thinking. One can see an intentional selection of such means to obtain his ends. For example, a pillow may be moved out of the way to reach for a toy, something he wouldn't have been able to do before. He shows an initial ability to anticipate events. Objects, things outside himself, including people, start to acquire a new measure of permanence. In other words, even though they are not present, they have some permanence. Before was out of sight, out of existence. While previously he ignored objects, in inverted commas, the moment they were out of his field of vision, by the 12th month, he starts to search for objects that he sees disappears. That was of no interest to him before the moment the object was not in his perceptual field. He lost all interest in it. This seems to imply that he starts to search for objects that he sees disappear. That he has acquired some kind of, that the objects have acquired some kind of existence or permanence outside the actual perceptual moment when they were being seen. Perhaps because of the above, he begins to realize that other objects in the environment can themselves initiate activity and be responsible for the causality of things. It is during this phase that the infant acquires the sense of the constancy of the shape and size of objects. This is in contrast with the earlier stage in which any change in distance from a given thing outside there, a given object outside, was understood in inverted commas, as a change in the object and not in the point of view of the subject relative to the object. You see the difference? It is not until this time, around the 8th or 9th month, that he starts to explore the perspective effects that are occasioned by the actual displacement of the objects in his field of vision. During this period, which is stage 4, and even toward the end of the previous one, the infant begins to distinguish between his own movements and those of the objects, while before he could not distinguish between movements of the object and those of his own body. But even more important than that is the fact that in the mind of the child, objects start to acquire a substance and a permanence that they did not previously have. Thus, if before this stage we had a rattle in which he is interested under a blanket, while he looks that we are hiding the rattle under the blanket, the infant doesn't search for it at all, out of sight, out of mind. In other words, out of sight, out of existence too. But somewhere between the 8th and the 10th month of age, the infant will begin to search for the object when hidden under the blanket, finally retrieving it. This seems to suggest that in the infant's mind, objects now exist after they disappear from his perception, from his sight. Yet there is still much to be acquired in this area, since the infant will look for the object where it usually disappears, and not necessarily where he saw it disappear. It is not until the infant reaches about 12 months that he becomes capable of looking for the object where it actually disappears, and not where he was used to see it disappear. So here now, develop a connection between the different spaces in which an object can disappear. Concomitantly, a child develops some awareness of his dependence on human objects for satisfaction of his needs, since he begins to understand that he cannot accomplish certain things without some help from that outside himself, while previously his belief was that he brought this about magically. He just whimpered or moved his arm and relief came, as if he was able to produce it, and with no awareness that the help came from the outside world. So at this point, he has started to understand that he really cannot accomplish certain things without some help from outside. Those objects, for the first time, start to be seen as the actual causes of certain activities. This particular stage is of very special significance for all later development. Piaget described it as the practical intelligence or sensory motor intelligence. For him, intelligence is observable long before the development of language, before words can be used as the tools and symbols of our thought processes. This practical intelligence, as he called it, applies instead to the manipulation of objects and utilizes only perceptions and organized movements in action schemes. On this basis, the infant is not contented anymore with reproducing and repeating familiar movements or activities that he finds interesting, but he now uses many variations of such movements and activities with an exploratory aim. Piaget gives the example of the child who throws objects to the floor from his high chair, now in this direction, now in another direction, in order to study direction and trajectories. When the child combines and coordinates various such schemes, reciprocal assimilation in Piaget's thinking, he begins a period of practical intelligence, properly speaking. He's kind of exploring intelligence with limits always. And the result of these advances of intellectual development, there is an enormous transformation in the way things are represented in the mind of the infant, finally leading to a differentiation between the self and the external world. But that doesn't mean to say that he has a clear knowledge of the external world. All that has happened is now he knows there is himself and something out there. But what is out there and the different things that are out there, the role that they play and so on, is something that has still to be understood as development proceeds. Thus, the infant now arrives at the conception that objects, things and persons outside the self do have a permanence and are substantial. In other words, there is now on the child's mind an actual belief or knowledge according to which the thing perceived corresponds to something that continues to exist, even though he can no longer perceive it. Not out of sight, out of existence as before. As mentioned earlier, by the third month of life, he can already recognize in inverted commas, certain familiar sensorial perceptual pictures. But the fact that he can recognize them when they are present does not necessarily mean that he can place them somewhere when they are outside of his perceptual field. Thus, he recognized, again recognized in inverted commas, persons and was aware that screaming made them reappear. But this is not proof that he attributed to them either permanence or substantial body in a space when he couldn't see them. To make this point, Piaget in 1967 reminds us that at the beginning, when the infant starts to grasp all he sees and is within reach, it shows no searching behavior if the desired objects are covered by a handkerchief, even if he saw us cover the object. Again, out of sight, out of mind, out of existence. Later on, he would search for the hidden object, but only, as we said earlier, when he saw it disappear the first time. You hide it in another place, he can do that. He will look for it when he saw it first disappear. If so, as I say, if we hide it under some other corner of the handkerchief, for example, he cannot find it, in spite of the fact that he saw us hiding it under a different corner on the handkerchief. As Piaget says, it is as if the object was part of a global gestalt and not a mobile element by itself. But according to him, this search for the object is the criteria that allows us to recognize the beginning of the exteriorization of the material world. In my own words, that there is something out there and not inside me. This move from inside to outside is a good example of the first step in the final elaboration of the external universe. In his conception, the concept of space and spaces are constructed in much the same way as the concept of objects. At the very beginning, there are many spaces without any coordination or distinction among them, as there are sensory perceptual fields or areas. Thus, there is a buccal, in the mouse space, a visual space, a tactile space, etc. But each such space is centered on or strictly linked with the infant activities and movements of which it forms an integral part with no existence of its own in its own right. Furthermore, the visual space, for example, does not know or recognize to start with the same depth that the infant will perceive later on. By the end of the second year, there has, look at the time, end of the second year, they have developed a concept of a general space that contains all other kind of spaces, the relations between objects and the child's own body. The elaboration of the space concept is essentially the product of the coordination of movements. According to Piaget, one can see here the close relation that exists between his development, coordination of movements, and the so-called sensory motor intelligence or practical intelligence. In terms of the concept of causality, Piaget says that at the beginning, causality is strictly related in the infant actions or activities to the, Piaget says that at the beginning, causality is strictly related to the infant actions or activities. In other words, he makes everything happen. This is described as magical causality. And indeed, Freud has referred to it as a period where the ego is magic, it does everything. And of course, it's a period of extreme egocentrism. It is not, though, until the second year that the child fully recognizes that there are other causal relations beyond those that he had at first. Piaget concluded that when certain objects, be that things or persons, are clearly differentiated and belonging outside the child's self, the awareness of the self becomes more affirmative and better delineated. In other words, there is a sense of an interior pole of reality opposed to that other objective and external pole of it. On the other hand, by analogy with the ego, the objects, things, and persons are conceived of as active, alive, willful, and conscious. Is what the analysts call the animistic stage. The choice of the object is thus correlated to the intellectual construction of the object. Then from 18 months onward, and thanks to the development of language, profound changes take place. The child can now reconstruct past events in verbal form and anticipate his future action by means of verbal representation. Three important consequences derive from this. One, an exchange of meaningful communication between individuals, that is, the beginning of the socialization of action. Two, an internalization. Piaget uses the term interiorization, not internalization, of a speech. That is, the beginning of thinking proper with the support system of the internal language and its symbols. In other words, the use of words. And third, an interiorization of action. Piaget rightly remarks that while language is not definitely developed, interindividual interactions are limited to imitations of body gestures and posture and to global affective relationships without well-differentiated communication. With speech, the infant shares his internal life, and at the same time it is built up consciously to the same extent that it can be communicated. And that covers the first part of this series of 3 lectures. The next one is called the stages in the development of the self, and the first one of those is a phase that I call the autoerotic non-self, non-object stage, and we will describe in great detail. Before we end, I want to show you that in the book, the references at the end here, Barry Wadsworth's Piaget Theory of Cognitive Development, published in New York, which I highly recommend. It's a beautifully done summary of Piaget's 8 stages, and so it's very worthwhile reading and very rewarding. And you have there the number of months that each one of the stages covers. The stage 1 is 1 month, 0 birth to 1 month, stage 2, 1 to 4, stage 3, 4 to 8 months, stage 4 is 8 to 12 months, stage 5 is 12 to 18 months, and the next stage, stage 6, is 18 to 24 months. Now here there is a summary that appears in the book, the reference of which I gave to you, which are the characteristics of development during the sensory motor period. Highly summarized, and it's not easy to follow without reading the actual book, but there it is. Now, this is something that we will discuss in more detail. But it's related to what we are talking about, and that is what Anna Freud described as the need satisfaction versus object constancy stage, which essentially means that for a long part of the first year of life, in fact up to probably the 14, 15 months of the infant's life, objects, in inverted commas, serve a purpose to satisfy the needs of the infant. In other words, the object that satisfies the need is not particularly important. It can be exchanged as long as the need is satisfied. Now, obviously, this is a long process, and by the time the human infant gets to the 13, 14, 15 months of life, he has developed what is called object constancy. In other words, now the object that satisfies the need is important, not the satisfaction of the need only. It has to be the same object, otherwise the child is traumatized by the loss of that object that is now a constant object, and is what some analysts will call the choice of its primary object, that be the most important first choice of a human object. We will discuss this in some more detail in the next 2 lectures. Thank you for your attention.